This is John Kofas. I am solely responsible for opinions and analysis expressed in this video. Now, today is April 20th, 2026, and it is a day that hostilities have started once again in the Persian Gulf between Iran and the United States, with its junior partner, of course, the United States' junior partner in the Middle East, Israel, and then the Persian Gulf states as supporting actors in the process, providing all sorts of support, logistical and otherwise, to the United States against Iran. The question that has been asked, and of course, many in the domain of journalism as well as scholars in international affairs, what sort of diplomacy is this that appears, at least on the surface, to be extremely chaotic and fruitless, going to the negotiating table and then leaving without an agreement, or having an agreement and violating the agreement. After all, this is exactly how this war against Iran started on February 28, 2026. The United States and Iran were negotiating, and then the US decided that it would start bombing Iran, with Israel getting into the act and especially pounding Lebanon. Um, and of course, Lebanon has been part of this war and victimized, although there has not been much press about Lebanon in this regard, especially in the Western press. On the surface, especially some of the behavior of the United States foreign policy during the Trump administration, which starts with Venezuela and the U.S., according to congressional testimony and according to revelations that have come out by journalists, the U.S. began blowing off ships in the Caribbean, arguing that those ships were carrying drugs from Venezuela to the United States. Therefore, the U.S. had every right to blow them out of the water, protecting its territorial sovereignty from the threat of narcotics. Although Democrats asked for evidence, empirical evidence, never was there anything provided, because there is no such evidence to be had. This is when a number of analysts began, this is long before the US and Israel war against Iran. A number of analysts began calling this sort of operation piracy. What followed, of course, was the next step was the snatching of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, at the end of 2025, and replacing him with his second in command, and then, of course, seizing the oil reserves, not seizing, but making sure that the oil reserves of Venezuela rather go under the management of the U.S., so the U.S. would have the right to determine who receives what oil from Venezuela. So Venezuela would lose sovereignty over the number one resource for export, namely oil. So national sovereignty would be lost to the United States. And the United States President Trump, in fact, just recently commented that now, with the oil reserves of the United States, of Venezuela, the United States has the largest reserves in the world. So the U.S. now, according to President Trump, considers the oil reserves of Venezuela, which, by the way, just for the record, are the largest indeed in the world, are now in the domain of US management, determining at the very least who gets what at what prices and so forth. This is another reason why some question this sort of diplomacy, whether it fits a pattern or whether it's just piracy. Um, and of course, combining this with uh, just yesterday, today is the 20th, yesterday was the 19th, a US naval vessel in the Persian Gulf seized a Persian oil tanker. And immediately there was the criticism, not just by Iran, by others as well, that this is piracy diplomacy. This is using pirate tactics to achieve a diplomatic goal, namely to have Iran sit at the negotiating table and literally yield to every demand of the United States rather than negotiate some middle ground and see if they can bring this war to an end. In my view, there is the pattern of U.S. diplomacy as much as and conduct, which, by the way, war is an extension of diplomacy. The pattern may seem chaotic, it may seem like this is piracy, but it fits a historical trend. And if we go back to the late 19th century, to the William McKinley administration during the Spanish American War, when gunboat diplomacy was used, and then a few years after McKinley, during the administration of William Howard Taft, um, who introduced dollar diplomacy, namely using investments and the power of the U.S. economy as leverage to impose U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The combination of gunboat diplomacy and dollar diplomacy from President McKinley to President William Howard Taft continued during the Wilson administration, who had his own problems with neighboring Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. There was a brief respite, a brief period of basically the US renouncing, to some degree, I would say, not totally, gunboat diplomacy, certainly. I wouldn't say that they renounced dollar diplomacy as much, but it was during their administration of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when the US needed Latin America, during a time when Japan, but especially Nazi Germany and Italy formed the Axis, the alliance, and Germany was becoming very aggressive in penetrating the markets of the Western Hemisphere. And to his credit, the Secretary of State under Roosevelt, Cordell Hull, conducted bilateral relations with his Latin American neighbors, and one after another, he began to make deals, economic deals with them, and really toned down the bellicose rhetoric that had been characteristic of United States foreign policy from actually even going before McKinley, back to James Polk in the 1840s during the U.S.-Mexico War. So in the 1930s we have a brief period called the good neighbor policy, where the U.S. was to be the good neighbor, which of course is an admission that it was not a good neighbor before that, by the way. So it pledges to be a good neighbor, to be a neighbor who conducts foreign policy on the basis of mutual respect and mutual interests within the Western Hemisphere. Now, clearly, all of this changes with the Bretton Woods system in 1944 as the US emerges the number one military, number one economic, and number one political power in the world at the end of World War II. And the US is in the position to manage the global economy. And in establishing the United Nations, obviously the US, the major power behind the establishment of the United Nations, from the Truman administration in the late 40s to the Eisenhower administration, at least the first Eisenhower administration, the United Nations was really a body that catered to the United States State Department. Now, as the 1950s unfold and the Soviet Union and China become increasingly more influential on a world scale, what happens is that the United and the non-aligned movement, the global South, most of the global South countries, becomes more influential. The US loses its influence within the UN and never gained it since then. And to this day, the US, of course, especially to this day, especially in the last 30 years, the United States has been a a loose partner member of the United Nations, certainly not the most loyal member. Just recently, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced that he would drop out of, I believe, some 66 global organizations. Roughly half of those are UN sub-agencies. So the US commitment, not to mention the money the US owes the United Nations, by the way, in membership fees. So the U.S. commitment to the UN, an organization that the U.S. created to further its global interests in managing the world economy and world affairs. The U.S. is the one that was the principal power behind this. The U.S. has drifted away from this. Now, what kind of policy is it pursuing? And why does it seem that the United States is unable to carve out a deal with Iran, which is a country linked to China and Russia, clearly? China and Russia, there are all sorts of reports, are solidly behind it, and there are reports that China and Russia have been delivering supplies of all sorts to Iran, helping it with satellite imaging and to basically target, to find targets that they wish to hit. So there is a question of why is the United States finding it so difficult, and what kind of policy is it pursuing? It has tried diplomacy and failed, and today, April 20th, 2026, it is again on the verge. It's already started, actually, considering there are two naval destroyers within the Persian Gulf already. They captured an Iranian oil tanker, and there is a report that the U.S. has sent fighter jets in Pakistan to prepare for all sorts of operations against Iran once again. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because it causes global economic chaos. It has caused inflationary pressures on a world scale. The United States operation against Iran and its failure to achieve a diplomatic solution has caused serious economic problems on a world scale, including and especially within Iran, first and foremost, but even within the United States, itself. And the IMF has made it very clear in its recent report that because of this war, the global economy stands to retreat in terms of global GDP growth in 2026, depending how long this goes on. It is not easy to determine to what degree there will be a retreat in global GDP growth at this point, but there will be a global GDP growth because of this war. And it is, again, the question is why pursue a conflict that backfires and undermines national capitalism in the United States, but also international capitalism? Is it because the United States believes it can ultimately prevail in this war? Is it because it's following a pattern of diplomacy that is a combination of gunboat diplomacy of the late 19th century and dollar diplomacy of the early 20th century? Namely, by the way, this is the age that historians call the age of imperialism. This is in college history courses. We call this the age of imperialism. This is the age that led to World War One. This is the period that was very dangerous because of reckless military adventures and because diplomacy took a back seat to military adventures, high risk military adventures back then in the late 19th, early 20th century for the sole purpose of carving out markets among the great powers. There were no superpowers back then, great powers, with the biggest rivals, of course, being Great Britain and Germany. And of course, others followed in among the great powers. Japan, the United States included in the group, but the European theater was the major theater there. Now, the interesting thing here is that the United States is indeed following a pattern that very much looks like that of the late 19th, early 20th century. And the reason is because the United States is not a superpower anymore. It is like a great power, as there were great powers back in the late 19th, early 20th century. And the reason it's not a great power, it's not a superpower, it's lost that superpower status, is very simple. The rise of China with the BRICS group, which it basically leads, it has been leading, expanding, and Russia on its side, Russia is part of the BRICS group as well. Russia, a major strategic partner and economic partner of China. India is in the BRICS group as well. The US is facing a multilateral world where there are indeed great powers. There is no superpower. So the superpower status of the United States that President George Herbert Walker Bush announced back in 1991 doesn't exist. And for the very simple reason is that the economy of the United States has been weakened since 1991. In the last 35 years, the economy of the United States has taken a huge beating because the debt of the United States is about to hit 40 trillion, by the way. In a GDP of the United States are between 29 and a half to 30 and a half trillion, somewhere in there, just under 31 trillion. And defense expenses rising 1 trillion right now, and the proposal is 1.5 trillion for the following year. So a runaway debt, uh, partly due to runaway defense spending because of military advances and because of the heavy reliance on defense as leverage for geoeconomic control, regaining markets lost to China, which, of course, when you look realistically, even when people like Warren Buffett and Goldman Sachs, as Wall Street as you can get, these are the icons of Wall Street, when they move assets away from the United States, knowing that the future is East Asia, and they move assets there, knowing that the geopolitical leverage that the United States is trying to use to achieve geoeconomic advantages, namely market share, isn't going to work. That the dollar will indeed continue to weaken. And the Iran situation is Iran, by the way, a small country, 93 million in terms of population, a small country in terms of defense budget, 8 billion versus 1 trillion against the United States. And when you put Israel in there, you got close to 1.5 trillion between those two, because Israel is in this war. Whether your analysis is that Israel has dragged the United States, and Israel has indeed played a big role in this, or the United States is a willing partner and it's doing it for its own reasons. And of course, there is the larger issue, which is why pursue, again, this is very important, why is the political class, and it's not just Republicans, by the way, it's not just Trump and the Republicans, it's also Democrats. It's also Democrats because the war in Ukraine started under Democrats. The war by Israel, the genocide of Israel in Gaza, started under Democrats. Trump is simply continuing the forever war doctrine that the Democrats and the neoconservatives in the United States under Democrats had been pursuing. This is just this continuity here. Trump is not the issue, the core issue. The core issue is the structure of United States foreign policy and what role it plays in the political economy. Now, there is some news just recently, in fact, yesterday, on this issue on why the U.S. is doing this, which is interesting because it is also a throwback to early Cold War thinking. The foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, stated that the U.S. is not interested in using nuclear weapons to destroy Iran. The U.S. simply wants to snatch the oil of Iran the way it did of Venezuela. Basically, the Kremlin's analysis of all this is that the United States is reverting to the early Cold War thinking of in fact, there's a very good book on this by the title of The Struggle for Minerals and Energy. There is a struggle for minerals and energy, and especially rare earth minerals. Rare earth minerals are very important for high tech and defense. So the United States is looking, as far as the Kremlin is concerned, looking at Iran from that angle. The U.S. doesn't particularly need the oil. U.S. has a lot of oil and natural gas. However, it didn't need it in the Truman and Eisenhower administration, but wanted to make sure that it was under friendly, allied, and pro-U.S. elements. So it's pursuing that sort of policy, a revival of the Cold War policy. Or again, Sergei Lavrov is a seasoned diplomat, by the way, and this is how he sees it. I don't particularly think that's the only angle. I think there is a lot more to it than that. And the reason is because the uh, the scientists who have studied the um, uh, the duration of fossil fuels and the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy maintained by the middle of the century in just 25 years, the world will need to rapidly move toward renewables. And the reason is because fossil fuel exploration will become too expensive. Now, it just so happens that China is the world's number one country in terms of production of renewable energy. Okay. The US has about one third of the productivity of renewable energy of China right now. And especially with this administration, but the previous wasn't that bad either, which was a Democratic administration, they don't seem to be that anxious to face the reality that fossil fuels are quickly becoming depleted and it will become expensive to continue to pursue. The other dimension of this is that there is a cost in pursuing military adventures to secure market share, as this war that the US and Israel have launched against Iran in order to, as the Kremlin analysis goes, in order to make sure that they control that oil and they control the passageways through the Strait of Hormuz, where the oil and trade takes place. Okay, fair enough. There are other issues here. There is the issue of the petrodollar. Energy is traded in petrodollars. More and more countries are abandoning the petrodollar and going for other reserve currencies recognized by the International Monetary Fund. Petrodollar control has indeed already been weakened, and it will continue to weaken for a very simple reason. US public debt is out of control. It's not because people are saying it, it is because the US is spending so much money that it prints more, and its productivity rate, according to the World Bank and the IMF, as well as other private analysts, the US GDP growth rate is not looking very good for the next 5 years. This is especially when compared to India and China, which are both BRICS group countries. So what we have here is the reality of basically very low GDP growth in the United States, especially when you compare it with China and India, which hovers around 5-6% for them. Okay, between 1 and 2% for the US, that's very low. And then rising public debt. Just recently, just a couple of days ago, China dumped US Treasury bonds. I believe 143, 144 billion in Treasury bonds. However, that's not the only thing. That's not the only problem. A number of US investors, China did what it did. It could have done it for any number of reasons, and it did, including geopolitical reasons, by the way. However, even American large institutional investors as well as billionaires are taking money and putting it in East Asian economies, in securities in East Asia, including in the Nikkei, in Japan, in other words, because they see better value in those currencies, in East Asian countries, in the securities of East Asian countries, better growth prospects, and they see stability, if not increase, in the value of those hard currencies when compared with the dollar. Now, is war going to solve those structural problems of monetary, fiscal, and debt issues that the United States is facing? Clearly not. However, this is where dogmatism comes in. This is where militarism is a way of life. This is where forever war doctrine comes in. And unfortunately, historically, it's not just now, but historically, when we look at those conducting foreign policy, they're human beings, they're blinded by delusions, they're blinded by expectations that are not realistic. The question is, what is the dilemma of the United States? Why can it not achieve a diplomatic solution? There are several obstacles, and I want to delineate some of those and point out that, in fact, um, delusions have driven a great deal of US foreign policy, along with the hope that the risk of hundreds of billions of taxpayer money, by the way, spent for this reckless operation, which could have been solved diplomatically, was worth it. Worth it for whom? The average American? Absolutely not, considering that the latest public opinion poll shows there is now an increase in the number of American people who are adamantly against this war. It is now close to 65% of the American public against it. The amazing thing to me is that there is still another 35% who support this war, considering the devastation to the U.S. economy. Everything from what they spend to fill up the gas tank to what they spend on essentials, everyday items of use. Um, One of the first issues here that has made diplomacy very difficult for the U.S., and I think the U.S. is really in a very difficult position because it will, yeah, as I stated 3 weeks ago, I did a video and I argued, by the way, that the U.S. has lost the war. U.S. and Israel have both lost the war. Israel, of course, doesn't want the war to be over, but that's another issue. Um, and they lost the war for a very simple reason. The war aims of every country that goes to war, at least the publicly stated war aims, the ones they want the public to believe these are the war aims we have, um, are not going to be realized, have not been realized, and they will not be realized for a very simple reason, and that is because Iran is not Venezuela. Iran is not Iraq. And for the other simple reason is that the United States here really has not won any war of any consequence since Vietnam. It lost Vietnam, and everything after that, it has also lost, unless you count the Gulf War as a victory. In any case, Iran turned out to be a much more formidable enemy, as the US calls it, than the US expected, because it has enormous leverage. Namely, it hits the neighboring states in the Persian Gulf, as well as Israel, that are right there, and that the US uses as satellites to hit Iran. At the same time, the Strait of Hormuz, that is enormous leverage globally. And the US was, in my view, there was a very clear sign that the US had lost this war when it called for everyone from NATO countries to Japan, it even as China, to help out to get the traffic moving, the commercial traffic moving in the Strait of Hormuz. And really, it did not get a response. And that's when the threats began by the White House that the US has no need for NATO. It doesn't need NATO. It has no need for it. It's useless. It's not helping in this unilateral campaign that the US undertook with Israel in the forefront. Again, the debate, did Israel drag the US into this the way that Israel dragged the US into the Iraq war under George W. Bush? Did the US really wanted this very much, and it wanted this for its own reasons? That it's both. It's a little bit of both. Another issue that the U.S. Another issue that has to do with United States delusions is, of course, the U.S. expected to go in, bomb Iran the way with Israel, and the way it had a quick resolution in Venezuela, it thought that it would have the same thing. This turned out to be a complete delusion. This did not happen. That's when the war of propaganda, the massive rhetoric propaganda war began, that somehow the US had destroyed everything in Iran, from its infrastructure to its navy to its air force, that Iran had no way of fighting back. And yet Iran was fighting back. So on the one hand, there was the rhetoric out of Washington. And on the other hand, there was the reality on the ground. And by the way, I want to point something else here, and that is the issue of credibility. And it's not just the U.S. government. The U.S. government has every right to issue propaganda statements. That's what governments have done throughout history. They propagate, especially during the war. The issue is the media also. The Western media blindly went along with all of this the way it usually does. And the reality, of course, on the ground contradicted what the Western media reflected, which was the official position of the United States government. And the fact that the US was asking allies and even rivals, come on, help us out here, put this thing to an end. Iran is not backing down, was proof. You don't need more proof than that. That's enough proof that the US was not prevailing, no matter what it was claiming regarding the destruction of Iran. Then, of course, came the threats of pushing the button, in other words, using nuclear weapons. And there were rumors that there were some people who were really serious, and they would, of course, have Israel do their dirty job for them. They know that is obviously a scenario for the end of Israel itself, and they know that is also an apocalyptic scenario. This is a scenario that is unthinkable, and it would mean the end of the United States as not just a superpower that it once was, but a great power, even that it is now. It would mean the end of it, because most warheads are in the world are in the possession of Russia and China combined, not the US. The US cannot go the route of using nuclear weapons against a country that has none. And one of the issues in the argument, in the propaganda argument of the West, Israel and the U.S. and the Western media has been they want to build nuclear weapons when they have made it clear since 2015, 2016 they want to negotiate that for economic development. And it was Donald Trump in 2017 that began to argue that he wanted out, and he did get out of that agreement that was signed by the Obama administration that was working to exchange for Iran to renounce nuclear weapons development. However, Iran will not renounce the issue of economic development, which includes, this is a very important point for the Iranian government in Tehran, and that is using nuclear energy development, which Saudi Arabia and other countries also are interested in. So nuclear energy development is not off the table. That's on the table. Iran insists on that. The U.S. wants to deprive them of this. This is why some scholars and some journalists have argued maybe the real goal of the U.S. and Israel in this war against Iran is not the nuclear issue at all, because they don't have nuclear weapons. Israel does, but there is silence on that issue, by the way. So the only regional country there that has nuclear weapons in the Middle East is Israel. Obviously, Pakistan and India do it in the Indian subcontinent as well. The real issue, some scholars have argued, and rightly so, and journalists, is really to debilitate the economy of Iran to the degree that it will not be a player in the regional balance of power. So the role of Iran in the regional balance of power as a partner of both Russia and China has been an issue here. Is the United States and, of course, Israel as its junior partner really concerned about nuclear weapons development? By the way, just for the record, nuclear weapons cannot be used. If they're used, it means suicide. Or is it to debilitate Iran economically? Exactly what Iran is trying to avoid by resisting. And this is one of the reasons that why so many Iranian leaders have come out and said, we either go on with this and prevail and have a diplomatic settlement that meets our demands for economic development and peace, by the way, and not just for us, but for the region, or we die. And the reason is because they know what the other side, at least some on the other side, among the political elites, want. They want to reduce Iran to rubble, and they say so as well, by the way. That's the interesting thing. Now, one of the unexpected aspects of this war by the United States against Iran was the enormous cost that they didn't anticipate, because it just dragged on. It's been going on since February 28th. And the U.S. went to Congress and asked for more money. And sure enough, a number of hawkish pro-Israel Democrats gave the money. Forever war doctrine Democrats gave the money. So it is a bipartisan issue, by the way. U.S. foreign policy has always been bipartisan, and there are very few progressives who are indeed committed to peace and want to divert the hundreds of billions wasted in this war and in all wars and in defense, runaway defense spending, and divert that money for economic and social development in the United States, for healthcare, for school, preschool, for childcare, for low-cost housing, for all sorts of social programs that are needed in the United States and are lacking. Now, the President of the United States has made it clear that he sees the role of the federal government as a provider for defense, not social development. But it's not just social development that has been hurt, economic development has been hurt, by the way. The economy of the United States, a segment of it, let me just qualify that, a segment of the US economy has actually done well. The obvious sector is the defense sector, energy. Energy and defense have done well. Now, subsidiary sectors, in other words, linked sectors linked to it, like technology, for example, especially high tech, artificial intelligence, linked to those, they've done well. However, the rest of the economy has not. And even this is at a cost of high inflationary pressures and the reality that longer term, the dollar will continue to erode as a hard currency in the world, in the basket of hard currencies that the International Monetary Fund holds. The dollar will continue to retreat. And more countries looking at the erratic behavior of the United States, at the lack of credibility of the United States. Credibility is a very important issue, by the way. And the question is, how much credibility does the United States have when its own congressmen and senators are questioning the manner that this war has been conducted? Some refuse to call it a war, by the way. Some refuse. It's not a war. Okay, bombs have been dropping since February 28th, but it's not. Hundreds of people have been killed, thousands have been killed, millions, both in Lebanon and in Iran, have been displaced. Massive damage, both to Lebanon and Iran, has been carried out by the United States and Israel, but it's not a war. It's certainly not a picnic. It's certainly not a celebration. The definition, the minimalist definition of war, they are trying to use in order to argue that, well, it's just a conflict. However, in this conflict, if they want to use that term, that's fine. In this conflict, the cost to all sides and to the entire world economy has been immense. And this is very evident by studies of institutions like the International Monetary Fund, which is certainly not pro-Iran, by the way. Okay, a creation of the United States is just down the street from the White House, the headquarters, points out this has devastating impact on the growth prospects of the global GDP in 2026 and in the next 5 years. This will linger on for the next 5 years. Now, the other issue that has been a surprise for the United States, I don't know why, but because the U.S. historically, when it found itself on the side of at the in the diplomatic negotiations, he has certainly been familiar with the issue of war reparations. Iran is demanding war reparations. Who is going to pay for the damage caused by an unprovoked war? Iran, of course, also wants to make sure that the territorial sovereignty, including the Strait of Hormuz, remains intact and that the U.S. does not interfere with the territorial sovereignty, and also provides the money that has been frozen into the billions overseas. The Iranian government looks at that as theft, by the way. This money belonged to Iran. Western governments confiscated that money. Iran wants it back. Um, so that is another issue. The reparations, as well as the money frozen, the assets frozen. But more important is the issue of developing nuclear energy and lasting peace, not 10-day ceasefire and then starting the, even before the 10 days are up, starting the war again, or 6 months from now, starting another war. There was a war, the US and Israel hit Iran back in June 2025. Now here we are again in 2026. So the US refuses to make any concessions. It went in with its own demands, and it wanted to hear nothing of the other side. Even Henry Kissinger, who was, by the way, fairly status quo, fairly conservative, and had his own unfortunate tragedies in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, in fact, war crimes, even he was realistic enough to know that when you sit down at a diplomatic table toward a solution for peace, it's a give and take situation. Uh, the one side, both sides present their conditions for peace, and there is what's called a compromise. In the case of the United States, there doesn't seem to be a propensity, a trend toward compromise, because the US simply wants to dictate. Now, some who have not studied actually US diplomatic history and foreign policy may think this is unusual, but actually, in the history of the United States, the US always dealt with countries, the great powers, as equals in the last 130 years or so. And then it dealt with lesser countries as subordinates and expected them to cater to US demands. So this is not so unusual. I don't see it as so unusual that it expects, except that Iran is not alone. China and Russia have made it very clear, both at the United Nations Security Council as well as in their own foreign ministries, have made it very clear that they are solidly behind Iran. Both China and Russia are watching Iran. They have a stake in making sure Iran does not lose. They sense that the US has lost because it has not achieved its war aims. Again, like I said, about 3 weeks ago, I did a video which argues that the US has not achieved its war aims. We have yet to see any of the achievements. And whereas when you contrast that with Iran's war aims, which were, if we just survive this thing, because Iran was on the receiving end, it was on the defense, not offense. If we come out at least surviving in this, even if there is some kind of deal where both sides back off without anything more than that, that would be a victory for Iran, because at least they went, they came out with no regime change as the US demanded, no concessions on any of the issues, the bigger issues, which is the US wants to control the Strait of Hormuz, the US wants to control, manage in the way they manage the Venezuelan oil assets, those of Iran. By the way, analysts have argued that the goal of the US, the larger geopolitical goal of the US and geoeconomic, is to deprive China of two major sources of oil, namely Venezuela and Iran. And China, the Chinese foreign ministry made it very clear to Washington, they were not going to go along with that, meaning um, it would be war, implying that if it comes to that, then conflict, because China can't survive without energy. China needs energy from other countries, from energy producing countries. There were veiled threats, let me put it together, by the Chinese foreign ministry that that the US has no right to interfere in its internal affairs. Let me put it in the diplomatic language the Chinese did. In the internal affairs of China, because it implies that they are violating commercial treaties that China has with third parties like Iran, for example. And this is interfering in internal affairs, and those are grounds for conflict. So this is another issue. However, there are more. There is the issue of the weakening U.S. economy, and in November, the U.S. has elections, and it just doesn't look good for the United States Republican Party in November. Even Republicans are now admitting they have this war will cost them at the very least the House of Representatives. It will cost them the House of Representatives. Now, there is still the possibility of US ground troops in Iran. Now, when you look at Iran geographically, it is a vast country. US did use ground troops in Afghanistan 20 years to defeat the Taliban. We know what happened there. Trillions of US taxpayer money wasted, and the Taliban are now in power in Afghanistan with cordial relations with both Iran and Russia, as well as cordial economic relations with China. So, why what was achieved by 20 years of wasting trillions in a country like Afghanistan? Nothing. The US had no gain. It destroyed Afghanistan. US destroyed Afghanistan. It did quite a bit of damage to Pakistan along the way, because which is right next door. It used it as a base of operations for Afghanistan. But it has nothing to show for it. And Trump and many Republicans keep saying, at least, and in Iraq, of course, they don't have much to show for it. And they keep saying, at least we should take everything, all the assets they have. Let's take their oil. This is what prompted a day or two, I believe, Sergei Lavrov to argue, you know what, the Americans really take them at their word. They just want the oil. And when Lavrov says the American, they do mean, by the way, the political class serving the oligarchy of Wall Street, as Senator Bernie Sanders calls them. Because the oligarchy, and within that oligarchy, a segment of it, because the oligarchy is not as monolithic as it may sound. It is pluralistic. There are many who clearly disagree with this course of action. They're not going to go against their government in time of war, but they think there is a better way. And obviously, when there are pauses in this war, there have been a couple, one can see stock markets from US all over the world going up. And then when conflict resumes, they go down again. And that says a lot. The issue I want to leave with this thought about credibility of the United States. The issue of credibility of the United States is not the president of the just the president of the United States. Yes, this is a person who uses very loose rhetoric, presenting, of course, himself as Jesus and all of that, and using rhetoric that, like, he will destroy the civilization of Iran, which is roughly 4,000 year civilization, which implies pushing the button. At least for some people, it implies that. or massive invasion, as though it would be worth it, as though anything came out of that in Afghanistan. Okay. But it's not just Trump. This is a reflection of America. Trump is the reflection of America. Trump is the manifestation of the American oligarchy. They put him there, they funded him, they funded his campaign in 2016 and 2024, as well as 2020, although he lost that one. Trump is the face of the oligarchy. He's not the face of the American working class or the middle class. He's a segment of them, yes, because some of them voted for him. He is solidly the face of Wall Street. He is solidly the face of the ideologues, the dogmatic individuals who believe that the United States can bring back the Pax Americana of Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, not realizing that China is here to stay, that the US best option is exactly what President Xi Jinping pointed out, and that is to compete with China at the economic level and to engage in constructive cooperation for harmonious interaction, international interaction, and economic equilibrium on a world scale. I am not optimistic about Iran. I think that the pressure will come from within the capitalist class, especially in the United States, when they will have had enough of pain, and when they will see, because everything is short term, everything is quarterly report. They're not looking ahead. They don't have 5-year plans like China does, by the way. They're looking at, are we going to do well in this quarterly report? When they see that things are not looking good, I think that they will force the White House to come to terms and to yield on some issues to Iran. And there will be peace. That's my optimistic. I want to remain optimistic. I hate to imagine the alternative scenario, which would be a bloodbath for the entire Middle East. When Iran says that's what's going to happen, that is exactly what's going to happen. Because they are on their homeland. They are not in Omaha and in Topeka, Kansas, and in Indianapolis, Indiana. They are in their own land, and they're fighting for their own land. They're fighting for their survival. This is not to make them out to be angels, by the way, but the regime of Iran is the business of the people of Iran, not of external forces claiming that they care about social justice of the Iranian people when their own record clearly indicates, in the case of Israel, that it is a country of apartheid with a genocidal record in the last couple of years in Gaza. And in the case of the United States, it has a long-standing history of segregation and of treating minorities, from blacks to Hispanics to Asians, much worse, and marginalizing them than it does the Northwest Europeans. So when the working class, of course, being subjected to conditions that are very poor historically. This is an anti-working class government, status quo government, pro-Wall Street. So when it comes to the issue of that their hearts are bleeding for social justice in Iran, they lack credibility because they don't practice it in their own countries. I want to leave it there, and I want to ask you to join this channel and to write comments. Thank you very much.